You know that feeling at the end of a long day when your lower back just aches? That dull, persistent throb that radiates from your spine down through your hips? Or maybe it's your knees, that grinding sensation when you stand up after sitting too long. Or your feet screaming after hours on concrete, arches collapsed, heels burning. If you've felt any of this, you're not alone, not even close. Global estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 80% of people will experience significant low back pain at some point in their lives. In 2021 alone, about 629 million people were living with it. That's not a rare condition. That's not bad luck. That's the single largest contributor to disability across the entire planet. So here's the question that should keep you up at night, except you're here to fall asleep. So maybe it's the question that should gently tug at your curiosity as you drift off. Why does the human body hurt so much just from doing what it's supposed to do? Why does walking, standing, just existing in an upright position cause so many of us so much pain? The answer takes us back, way back, past your childhood, past your grandparents, past the invention of agriculture and cities and language, back millions of years to a decision, or maybe not a decision, more like a slow-motion accident that changed everything, the evolution of bipedalism, walking on two legs. Here's the thing, almost no other mammal does this. Sure, bears can rear up, kangaroos hop, prairie dogs stand to look around, but habitually, as a way of life, moving through the world balanced on just two limbs? That's weird. That's a bizarre solution to the problem of getting from point A to point B. And if you look at the engineering, it makes even less sense. 4 legs are stable. 2 legs are a constant act of controlled falling. 4 legs distribute your weight efficiently. 2 legs channel all that force through a few overworked joints. 4 legs, you're low to the ground, hard to knock over. 2 legs, you're a wobbly tower waiting for gravity to win. And yet, here we are, 8 billion wobbly towers, walking around on 2 legs, wondering why our backs hurt. This is a detective story, a mystery written in ancient bone and reconstructed in university labs and argued about in scientific journals at 2 a.m. The clues go back more than 7 million years. Fragmentary skeletons with names like Sahelanthropus and Ardi and Lucy. Footprints pressed into volcanic ash 3.6 million years ago and preserved like a frozen moment of time. Fossils that show a body slowly, painfully, being re-engineered from a 4-legged blueprint into something new. Something that could walk for miles. Something that could carry things. Something that could eventually build pyramids and write symphonies and send robots to Mars. But evolution doesn't give gifts for free. Every adaptation is a trade-off. Every advantage comes with a price, and we're still paying it every single day. In doctors' offices and physical therapy clinics and late at night when you shift position trying to find a way to lie down that doesn't make your lower back scream. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you right now and what time is it? I love seeing that. Someone in Tokyo at sunrise, someone in London at midnight, someone in Chicago at bedtime, all drifting off together to a story that starts 7 million years ago. So let's go back to a world before we stood, back to the deep time when our ancestors made a choice that would echo forward into every step you've ever taken and every ache you've ever felt. Picture this, 8 million years ago, maybe 10. It's hard to be precise when you're dealing with timescales that make human history look like a sneeze. The world is warm. Warmer than today. Not tropical everywhere, but close. Dense forests stretch across much of Africa. Not the kind you can stroll through, more like walls of green so thick you'd need a machete just to move 10 feet. Canopy overhead blocking most of the sunlight. Vines everywhere, the air heavy and wet. But here's the thing about that world. It's changing, has been for millions of years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly if you're living in it generation by generation, but relentlessly. The planet is cooling, not crashing into an ice age, not yet, but drifting towards something different. By about 7 million years ago, maybe a bit later, sea surface temperatures are dropping toward levels we'd recognize today. That might not sound dramatic, but shift ocean temperatures a few degrees and you shift rainfall patterns across entire continents. Subtropical regions start drying out, and in Africa, the great forests begin to fracture. Meanwhile, beneath the ground, tectonic forces are literally tearing the continent apart. The East African Rift System. It started opening something like 25 million years ago, but it's still actively spreading, still building highlands and volcanoes and deep basins. This isn't some gentle process. It's violent geology happening in slow motion, mountains rising, valleys sinking, lakes forming and disappearing. And all of this reshapes how rain falls, where rivers flow, what kinds of plants can grow where. So by the late Miocene, let's say 8 to 6 million years ago, you've got this incredible patchwork emerging across East Africa. Not uniform anything, not endless forest giving way cleanly to endless grassland like the old textbooks used to say. Instead, you've got mosaic environments. Imagine standing on a hillside and looking out over a landscape that's forest in the valley, woodland halfway up, patches of open grassland on the ridges, rivers cutting through with gallery forests along their banks, clearings where lightning strikes or elephants have knocked down trees. Some areas still thick canopy, others increasingly open to the sky. Now, living in these forests and woodlands are apes. Lots of them. Multiple species, most of which we'll never find fossils of because jungles don't preserve bone well. They're moving through the trees, eating fruit, occasionally coming down to the ground to cross between forest patches or forage for something they can't reach from above. And somewhere in this world, probably between 10 and 7 million years ago, there's an ape that's our last common ancestor with chimpanzees. Not a chimp, not a human, something else. We don't have a fossil of this creature, might never find one, but we can make educated guesses about what it was like. Probably more at home in trees than on the ground, but comfortable in both places. Maybe it moved along branches using all 4 limbs. Maybe it hung from branches and fed while upright. Maybe, and this is contested, it occasionally walked on its knuckles when it came to the ground, the way modern chimps and gorillas do. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it scrambled and climbed and moved in ways that don't fit neatly into any modern category. Here's what we know for sure. Somewhere in this world of fragmenting forests and spreading patches of open ground, some lineage of apes began spending more time upright. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic moment where one individual stood up and never sat down again. Gradually. Incrementally. Maybe they were reaching for fruit on flexible branches where standing steadied them. Maybe they were carrying food across gaps between trees. Maybe crossing open ground upright let them see over tall grass to spot predators. Maybe all of the above. Maybe none of the above. But whatever the specific pressures, whatever the exact sequence of environmental and behavioral changes, bipedalism was beginning. Not in creatures that looked like us, not in anything you'd recognize as human if you saw it moving through those ancient woodlands, in animals that were still fundamentally apes, still built for climbing, still more comfortable with branches than grassland. But slowly, generation by generation, their bodies were being pulled in a new direction, towards something that would eventually become us. Toward a way of moving that would reshape every bone, every muscle, every aspect of how a primate body works, and toward every back pain, every bad knee, every difficult childbirth that would follow for the next 7 million years. Now we get to the actual evidence, the bones, the fragments of skull and limb that paleontologists dig out of ancient sediments and argue about for decades. And here's the first thing you need to understand about the earliest fossil candidates for bipedalism. They're maddeningly incomplete. We're not talking about Lucy-level preservation here. We're talking about a piece of femur, a partial skull, fragments of jaw with a few teeth still attached. And from these broken remnants, scientists try to reconstruct how an animal moved 7 million years ago. Let's start with the oldest, the one that might, emphasis on might, push human bipedalism back further than we ever expected. Sahelanthropus chadensis. The name alone tells you this isn't your typical East African fossil story. Chadensis, from Chad, Central Africa, far west of the Rift Valley where most early hominin fossils turn up. Discovered in 2001 at a site called Toros Manala by a team working in the Jurab Desert. What they found was a skull, almost complete, flattened and distorted by millions of years of geological pressure, but remarkably preserved for something that old. They called it Tumai. The name means hope of life in the local Goran language. It's given to children born just before the dry season, when survival is uncertain. Fitting, because this skull arrived at a moment when paleoanthropology desperately needed something from this time period. And the age, about 7 million years old, right at the edge of when genetic studies suggest the human and chimpanzee lineages split. The skull itself is strange. The face is relatively short, not as protruding as a chimpanzee's. The brow ridge is prominent but not massive. The teeth show a mix of ape-like and potentially hominin-like features. But here's what caught everyone's attention: the foramen magnum. That's the hole at the base of your skull where your spinal cord enters. In quadrupeds, animals that walk on all fours, this hole is positioned toward the back of the skull because the spine enters from behind. In bipeds, in humans, it's positioned more toward the center, more forward, because the spine enters from directly below when you're standing upright. The Tumai skull's foramen magnum sits in an intermediate position, more forward than you'd expect in a typical quadrupedal ape. Not as far forward as in modern humans, but somewhere in between. The discoverers argued this meant Sahelanthropus could hold its head upright over a vertical spine, that it was a biped, or at least moving in that direction, that this was a very early member of the human lineage, perhaps the earliest we've found. Critics were less convinced. A skull alone doesn't tell you how an animal moved. Plenty of arboreal primates hold their heads relatively upright when climbing, and the foramen magnum position, while suggestive, wasn't definitive. For 2 decades, Sahelanthropus remained tantalizingly ambiguous, important because of its age and location, controversial because nobody could prove how it walked. Then came 2026, new analysis, not of the skull this time, but of limb bones that had been found at the same site back in 2001 but never fully studied. A femur, upper arm bones. The research team used advanced 3D imaging to examine every surface, every ridge, every subtle feature where muscles would have attached, and they found something remarkable. On the femur there's a tiny bump, a tubercle where a particular muscle connected. This bump, they argued, appears only in bipeds within the human lineage. It's part of the adaptation that lets us balance on one leg while the other swings forward during walking. More than that, the femoral shaft showed inward twisting, a torsion pattern, the kind you see in creatures that regularly stood with their legs beneath them rather than splayed out to the sides. The muscle attachment sites suggested a particular configuration of hip and thigh muscles. Not like a knuckle-walking chimp, not like a quadrupedal ape, like something that spent significant time walking upright. If this interpretation is correct, if this femur really does show clear adaptations to bipedalism, then habitual 2-legged walking goes back at least 7 million years. That's enormous. That pushes the timeline back by roughly 1 million years from most previous estimates. That means bipedalism evolved almost immediately after we split from chimpanzees, or possibly even contributed to that split. But, and this is a big but, not everyone is convinced. The bones are fragmentary, they're damaged. Some of the analysis used casts rather than the original fossils. And here's the fundamental problem. The same features that one researcher sees as evidence of bipedalism, another researcher can interpret as consistent with a quadrupedal ape, maybe one that occasionally climbed or moved in trees in unusual ways. The same tiny bump on a bone becomes either revolutionary evidence or meaningless variation depending on who's examining it and what assumptions they bring. This isn't bad science. This is frontier science. This is what happens when you're trying to reconstruct behavior from incomplete material at the absolute edge of the fossil record. Every interpretation is probabilistic. Every conclusion comes with caveats. And the honest answer is we don't know for certain how Sahelanthropus moved. It might have been an early biped. It might have been something else entirely. It might not even be a hominin at all, but some other lineage of apes that independently evolved a few bipedal traits. Now move forward in time, not far, about 1 million years, 6 million years ago. Kenya, the Tugan Hills. Another fragmentary discovery, this one called Orrorin tuganensis. Orrorin, the name comes from a local word meaning original man, and tuganensis from the Tugan Hills where it was found. The fossils, teeth, bits of jaw, a few finger bones, and critically several pieces of femur, thigh bone, the best preserved femur catalogue number BAR 10020 if you want to get technical, shows something intriguing. The neck of the femur, where it connects to the hip socket, is long and flattened front to back. The cortical bone, the dense outer layer, is thicker on the bottom side than the top. There's a groove where a particular muscle would have passed, a pronounced bump where the gluteal muscles attached, all features that in later hominins are associated with walking upright. Detailed morphometric analysis puts the Orrorin femur somewhere between Miocene apes and later Australopiths like Lucy. Not quite modern, not quite ancient ape. Something in transition. The interpretation, Orrorin probably walked bipedally at least some of the time, maybe frequently. But it almost certainly also spent significant time in trees, climbing, grasping branches, moving in ways that required different adaptations than pure ground-dwelling bipedalism. Again, the same caveats apply. The material is fragmentary, the features are subtle. Different researchers looking at the same bone can reach different conclusions about whether it shows true bipedal adaptation or something more ambiguous. And there's no complete skeleton that would let us see how all the pieces fit together, how the hip connected to the spine, how the foot was built, whether the pelvis showed the characteristic broadening and reorientation that marks committed bipeds. So here we are, 7 million years ago, 6 million years ago, right at the edge of the fossil record for our lineage. And what do we have? Tantalizing hints, suggestive features, a skull with a foramen magnum in an interesting position, a femur with a tiny tubercle that might mean everything or nothing, fragments that could rewrite the story of human origins, or could turn out to be side branches, evolutionary experiments that went nowhere. This is the honest uncertainty at the heart of paleoanthropology, the recognition that we're building narratives from incomplete evidence, that a single bump on a 7-million-year-old bone can reshape our entire understanding of when and how our ancestors started walking. That the difference between revolutionary discovery and ambiguous fragment often comes down to interpretation, to which features you emphasize, to what you compare the fossil against. But here's what makes this exciting rather than frustrating. Every new discovery refines the picture. Every advance in imaging technology lets us see features we missed before. Every comparative study of modern primates gives us better frameworks for interpreting ancient bones. The story keeps getting richer, more complex, more detailed. We might never know for absolute certain whether Sahelanthropus walked like us. but we keep getting closer to understanding what the possibilities were, what the ancient world allowed, what pressures shaped those earliest experiments in standing upright. And somewhere in those fragmenting forests between 7 and 6 million years ago, something was changing. Maybe it was Sahelanthropus, maybe Orrorin, maybe some other creature we haven't found yet. But the first steps toward humanity were being taken, tentative, uncertain, still half in the trees, but unmistakably pointing towards something new. Now we come to one of the most extraordinary fossil discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology. Not because it's the oldest, we just talked about older candidates. Not because it's the most complete, though it's remarkably complete for something this ancient, but because of what it shows us, the sheer complexity, the refusal to fit into simple categories, the way it forces us to rethink almost everything about how bipedalism evolved. Meet Ardi, Ardipithecus ramidus, found in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia. And when I say found, I mean painstakingly excavated, fragment by fragment, over years of fieldwork in one of the hottest, most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The key specimen, a partial skeleton designated ARA-VP-6/500, was discovered in 1994, a single tooth poking out of a hillside. That tooth led to more bones, then more, eventually 125 pieces of a single individual, skull fragments, teeth, pieces of pelvis, hands, feet, parts of the spine and ribs. But here's the thing about fossils this old. They don't come out of the ground looking like museum displays. 4.4 million years does things to bone. These fragments were crushed, mineralized, embedded in rock so fragile it could crumble at a touch. The team spent 15 years reconstructing Ardi, 15 years of careful preparation, digital scanning, comparative analysis, trying to understand how these flattened, distorted pieces originally fit together. The formal scientific description wasn't published until 2009, 15 years after that first tooth appeared. When the reconstruction was finally complete, what emerged was something nobody quite expected. Ardi stood about 120 centimeters tall, not quite 4 feet, weighed around 50 kilograms, maybe 110 pounds, small by modern human standards. Her brain was tiny, around 320 cubic centimeters, about the same size as a chimpanzee's. In terms of raw brain power, she wasn't dramatically different from living apes. But her body was a mosaic, a collection of features that didn't belong together according to any simple evolutionary narrative. And that mosaic is what makes her so important. Start with the pelvis. In quadrupedal apes, chimps and gorillas, the pelvis is long and narrow. It's built for powerful climbing, for supporting the body horizontally. The iliac blades, the broad flat bones at the top of your hips, angle backward. This makes sense for an animal whose spine runs parallel to the ground. But Ardi's pelvis was different, shorter, broader. The iliac blades were reoriented, rotated more to the sides. The whole structure showed clear modifications for supporting weight vertically, for balancing on 2 legs. This is the signature of bipedalism, not human bipedalism yet, not the fully committed adaptation we see in later fossils, but unmistakably moving in that direction. The hip socket, the acetabulum, was positioned in a way that suggests she could extend her hip joint for upright walking. The lower portion of the pelvis retained powerful musculature for climbing, but the upper portion was being remodeled for a new way of moving. Now look at her foot. Oh, and this is where things get really interesting. Ardi's big toe, her hallux, was divergent. It stuck out to the side like a thumb. She could grasp with it, wrap it around branches. This is an arboreal adaptation. Tree climbers need grasping big toes. Modern humans lost this completely. Our big toes are aligned with the other toes, locked in position to create a rigid lever for pushing off during walking. We traded grasping ability for walking efficiency, but Ardi hadn't made that trade yet. She still had the grasping toe, yet the rest of her foot was different from Ape's, stiffer, more rigid. The midfoot bones showed adaptations that would have helped her push off the ground during bipedal walking, even with that divergent big toe. She was trying to do both, climb trees and walk on the ground, and her foot was a compromise between two very different ways of moving. Her arms and hands tell the same story. Long arms, proportionally longer than later hominins, though shorter than modern chimps. Her fingers were curved, built for grasping, built for pulling herself up through branches. But her wrist showed features that suggest she didn't knuckle walk the way modern chimps and gorillas do. She might have walked on her palms when on the ground, or more likely she simply spent most of her time in trees and her rare ground travel was bipedal rather than quadrupedal. This matters. This is huge. Because for decades, the assumption was that early hominins must have gone through a knuckle-walking stage, that we evolved from something chimp-like that walked on 4 legs, supporting its weight on the knuckles when on the ground. Ardi suggests a different path. Maybe the common ancestor of humans and chimps wasn't a knuckle-walker at all. Maybe chimps evolved knuckle-walking after we split, and our lineage went from some other form of tree climbing directly toward bipedalism, without passing through a dedicated terrestrial quadrupedal stage. But here's what really challenges the classic narrative: the environment, the place where Ardi lived. For generations, anthropology textbooks told a simple story. Early hominins evolved bipedalism to survive in open grasslands. The forest was shrinking, the savanna was expanding. Our ancestors had to adapt to a treeless world. Standing upright let them see over tall grass, travel efficiently between scattered food sources, free their hands to carry things across open ground. Except Ardi didn't live in open savanna. The geological and paleontological evidence from the Aramis deposits is clear. This was woodland, river margin forest, dense vegetation. The associated fossils tell the story. Forest monkeys, kudus, which are woodland antelopes, peafowl, seeds from trees and woody plants. Carbon isotope analysis of Ardi's teeth and the teeth of other animals found with her shows they were eating woodland resources, not grassland plants. This was a closed canopy, or at least heavily wooded environment. So bipedalism didn't evolve in response to open grasslands. It couldn't have. Ardi was walking upright in the woods, among the trees, in exactly the kind of environment where you'd expect natural selection to favour continued arboreality, not terrestrial locomotion. This is where the postural feeding hypothesis becomes relevant. Watch modern apes in forests, chimps, orangutans, even smaller primates. When they want to reach fruit on flexible branches that won't support their full weight, they don't just climb out onto the branch. They stand. They adopt an upright posture, gripping with their feet, reaching overhead with their hands to pluck fruit or leaves. It's not terrestrial bipedalism, it's arboreal bipedalism, standing upright in trees. Maybe that's where it started, not on the ground at all, but in the canopy, standing on branches to feed. This would have selected for better hip extension, for the ability to balance vertically, for pelvic modifications that let you hold your body upright while your hands did other things. And once you have those adaptations for standing upright in trees, they also make you better at walking upright when you do come down to the ground. The terrestrial bipedalism we think of as defining humanity might have emerged as a side effect of standing upright to feed in trees. Ardi shows us this transition in progress. She could walk bipedally on the ground more effectively than living apes, but she clearly still spent enormous amounts of time in trees. Her long arms, her grasping big toe, her curved fingers, these weren't vestigial leftovers. These were functional adaptations she was actively using. Bipedalism and arboreality coexisted in her body, For millions of years, early hominins lived in both worlds, part-time ground walkers, part-time tree climbers, not one replacing the other overnight, but new abilities layered onto old ones. Evolution doesn't erase the past instantly. It tinkers, it adds, it modifies existing structures for new purposes. Ardi is the embodiment of that process, a creature caught between two ways of life, carrying the legacy of an arboreal past while experimenting with a bipedal future. And in her reassembled bones, painstakingly reconstructed after 15 years of effort, we see something profound. The recognition that becoming human wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a long, messy process of compromise and adaptation, of trying to survive in changing forests with a body plan that hadn't fully committed to either trees or ground. She's the in-between creature, and she changed everything we thought we knew about how we learned to walk. By the time Ardi's descendants had been experimenting with upright walking for another 1,000,000 years, the story changes tone. The bodies are different. The landscapes are shifting. The hesitation is fading. We step into East Africa again. Still a world of trees and rivers, but now with more open patches, more edges between forest and grass. A mosaic, not a single uniform habitat. And in that mosaic lives a creature whose bones will one day become almost as famous as the word human itself. Australopithecus afarensis. You probably know her by a different name. Lucy. Her story starts in 1974 in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, a hot, dry basin where wind cuts across bare sediments and ancient bones lie just beneath the surface, waiting for anyone patient enough to see them. A field team was surveying low ridges near a site called Hadar when one of them spotted a bit of arm bone sticking out of the ground. Then a fragment of skull, a jaw, vertebrae. Over the next days, more and more pieces emerged. By the time the excavation stopped, they had roughly 40% of a single skeleton. That is an astonishing amount for a creature more than 3 million years old. They estimated her age at about 3.2 million years, adult but small, around 1.1 meters tall, barely 3.5 feet, maybe 25 to 30 kilograms in weight. She was not a giant, not a towering ancestor striding across the savannah. And her brain? Around 400 cubic centimeters, in the same range as a modern chimpanzee. If you could hold a cast of her brain case in your hands, it would feel surprisingly small. No swelling of the forehead, no great bulging of the frontal lobes, no sign in raw volume of the cognitive explosion that would come later. But her skeleton tells a different kind of story, not about thinking, about moving. Start with her pelvis. Remember Ardi's short, broad, reoriented hip bones. Lucy's pelvis takes that experiment and pushes it further. The iliac blades are even more flared to the sides. The whole structure is basin-shaped, bringing the attachment points for gluteal muscles around to the side of the body. This is what lets you stand on one leg without tipping over every time you take a step. Those side-placed muscles act as stabilizers, keeping your pelvis level as you walk. In apes that walk on 4 limbs, those muscles work differently. They extend the hip, helping to push the body forward. In Lucy, they have been rewired by evolution to keep her upright on one leg at a time. That's not a casual adaptation. That is the hallmark of an animal that spends a lot of time walking bipedally. Now follow the line of her thigh. The femur does something crucial. It angles inward from hip to knee. This is called a valgus knee. If you look at your own legs in a mirror, you see the same inward sweep. It brings your knees under your center of gravity. Each step becomes a controlled fall, the foot landing beneath your body rather than out to the side. Lucy's femur angle is well within the human range. Not an ape that occasionally stands. A walker. Her knee joint shows thickened, reinforced condyles, especially on the outer side. These are weight-bearing surfaces, remodeled over generations to absorb the repeated stresses of upright walking, knees that expect the load of a biped, step down to her lower leg and foot. We don't have Lucy's complete feet, but other or afarensis fossils in the shape of her leg bones point to broad heels and a more rigid midfoot, the kind of architecture that supports a springy arched foot, not the flexible grasping foot of Ardi, not the branch-wrapping toes of a chimp. At the same time, Lucy's arms are shorter relative to her legs than Ardi's were, still long compared to ours, but the proportions have shifted. The body's investing more in hind-limb locomotion, less in forelimb-dominated climbing, yet her fingers remain long and curved. Her shoulder blade still tilts upward in a way that suggests powerful overhead reaching. She's not a ground-only animal. She's a creature of the in-between, but now the balance has tipped. Trees are still part of her life, perhaps for sleeping, for refuge, for feeding. However, the skeleton says that when she moves from place to place, when she travels across that patchy landscape, she does it on two legs. This is where another line of evidence enters the story and locks it in place. Not bones, not skull fragments, footprints, northern Tanzania, Letoli. About 3.6 million years ago, long before Lucy died in Ethiopia, a volcano sent a thin sheet of ash drifting across the landscape. It settled like grey snow, coating the ground in a fine, powdery layer. Then came rain, just enough moisture to turn the ash into a soft, sticky paste. Somewhere nearby, a small group of hominins walked across this fresh, wet surface. They were not doing anything dramatic. They were simply going from one place to another. Perhaps a pair, maybe an adult and a smaller companion, with a third individual crossing paths. No one knew they were being recorded. But every step pressed a story into the ground. More ash fell. Time passed. Sediments buried those tracks. For millions of years they lay sealed, a fossilized memory of an ordinary walk. In the 1970s, researchers uncovered them, a trackway stretching nearly 30 meters, around 70 individual prints, and when paleoanthropologists studied their shape, they saw something quietly astonishing. The walkers at Letoli landed on their heels first. You could see the deep impression of the calcaneus, the heel bone. Then the weight rolled forward along the outer edge of the foot, finally pushing off at the toes. The big toe in particular left a strong mark at toe-off. This is the same basic heel-to-toe gait pattern you use when you cross a room. The big toe itself is not splayed out to the side. It lies in line with the other toes, forming a unified front. No divergent thumb-like hallux. The midfoot region shows evidence of an arch, a lifted centre that lets the foot act as a spring and a lever instead of a floppy grasping pad. Biomechanically, these are not the tracks of a knuckle walker. They are not the tracks of an ape awkwardly balancing on hind limbs for a few steps at a time. They look, in crucial ways, like the footprints you might leave on a damp beach. Most researchers connect these prints to Australopithecus afarensis. The age matches, the region matches. Afarensis fossils have been found in nearby deposits of similar time. It is an inference, not a signed confession, but a strong one. More recently, another set of prints at Letoli from a slightly different site has been re-examined. Those tracks look stranger, a more cross-stepping gait, a foot that may have been shaped differently. That hints that there was more than one kind of upright walker on that landscape. Multiple hominins, each exploring bipedalism in its own way. But whatever their exact identities, the Letoli tracks tell us this. By 3.6 million years ago, long before modern humans, long before stone tools become common in the record, some of our relatives were fully committed to walking on two legs, habitual bipeds, leaving human-like footprints in volcanic ash. And Lucy, living a few 100,000 years later, embodies that commitment in bone. Her tiny brain case says one thing, Cognitively, she belongs with apes. No dramatic increase in volume, no sign of the encephalization that will characterize the genus Homo. Her hips, knees, and legs say something else entirely. They say that the experiment in upright walking had reached a new phase, no longer a part-time strategy, no longer just a posture for feeding in trees. Walking had become a way of life. This sequence matters. For most of the 20th century, it was tempting to imagine big brains leading the way, intelligence first, anatomy following along, or to imagine tool-making as the spark, hands freed for tools, brains growing to design them, bodies catching up. Lucy and the Latoli footprints turn that story upside down. Bipedalism came first, millions of years before the dramatic brain expansion, millions of years before the earliest widespread stone tools. Our ancestors were walking like us while still thinking in many ways like apes, and they were not alone. Australopithecus is not a single straight line of ancestors, but a cluster of related species spread across Africa. Australopithecus anamensis, a bit older than Lucy's kind. Australopithecus africanus, a bit younger, living further south. Forms like Australopithecus garhi that seem to hover near the threshold of our own genus, each with its own blend of arboreal and terrestrial traits, each tweaking the basic bipedal template in different directions, nature running parallel experiments with the same underlying idea, a small-bodied primate still at home among branches, yet relying more and more on 2 feet to move through a changing world. When you feel the pull in your calves after a long day, or the dull ache in your lower back, you are feeling the legacy of those experiments. The pelvis reshaped in Lucy's time, the valgus knee angle stamped into the Letterly ash, the arched foot that left such clear impressions in that ancient rain-soaked layer. All of it was set in motion long before anyone you would recognize as human ever looked up at the sky and wondered why they walked the way they did. Lucy and the Latoli footprints tell us that our ancestors were walking on 2 legs. They do not tell us why. This is where the story softens into something like a quiet detective tale. The bones are on the table. The ash prints are measured, scanned, compared. Everyone agrees. By 3 to 4 million years ago, some hominins were committed bipeds. But when paleoanthropologists lean back and ask, in the most basic way, so, what for? The room does not fall into silence because the answer is obvious. It falls into silence because there is no single answer at all. Instead, there is a small forest of hypotheses. Some are old and have been pruned back. Some are newer, still fragile. Many overlap. Most are probably partly right and partly wrong. Together they form a kind of mosaic, just like the landscapes Lucy walked through. We can stroll through them, one by one. For much of the 20th century, one story stood above the rest. It is often called the savanna hypothesis. In this picture, the world cools and dries in the late Miocene and early Pliocene. Forests contract, grasslands spread. Our ape-like ancestors are imagined as tree-dwellers suddenly stranded in a land of tall grasses and scattered shrubs. Forced out of the canopy, they adapt to the open. Standing up, the story goes, lets you peer over the grass, scanning for predators or distant trees heavy with fruit. Long, upright legs carry you efficiently between waterholes and groves. Hands, now freed from quadrupedal locomotion, can carry tools or food across those bare distances. Bipedalism, in this view, is the quintessential savanna adaptation, an answer to life on a treeless plain. It is an elegant story. It fits our intuition about African grasslands. It fit for a long time what little we thought we knew. But then the sediments began to speak more clearly. When researchers started reconstructing the ancient environments of early bipeds, looking at fossil pollen, animal bones, stable isotopes in teeth, they did not find endless, empty savannas. They found mixed habitats, wooded areas threaded with open patches, riverine forests bordering scrubby grasslands, a patchwork. Ardipithecus, around 4.4 million years ago, lived in woodland with trees dense enough to support climbing life. Early Australopithecus species, including Lucy's kind, are associated with these mosaic environments too. Even studies of modern chimpanzees living in savanna-like settings show that given the choice, they remain highly arboreal, using trees as safe hubs and only venturing across open ground when necessary. The pure, kicked out of the trees onto a flat, grassy savanna version of the story starts to crumble under the weight of this evidence. So the savanna hypothesis has been rewritten, softened into something more nuanced. Not a sudden exile from forest to prairie, but a slow dance along shifting edges. A savanna mosaic picture, where hominins move between clumps of trees and open spaces, never entirely abandoning either. In that patchwork, upright walking may still have helped with visibility and long-distance travel, but it probably did not appear because forests vanished overnight. Other pressures were at work. One of the most influential alternatives does not begin on the ground at all. It begins back in the trees, with what's called the postural feeding, or arboreal bipedalism hypothesis. If you spend time watching modern great apes in the wild, you'll notice something quietly familiar. When a chimp or bonobo is balanced high on a flexible branch, reaching out for fruit just beyond easy grasp, it often does something very human-looking. It stands. Not for a long stroll, but in a brief, careful balancing act. Feet placed side by side on a branch, arms stretched upward or outward for stability, an upright trunk, two legs bearing the weight while the hands harvest food. In this scenario, selection first favours apes that are good at this kind of vertical orthograde posture in the canopy. Strong hips and lower backs that can handle an upright stance on unstable branches. Feet and ankles that can balance a body stacked over them. Hands freed, for a moment, to pull in fruit and leaves. Over many generations, those same anatomical tweaks make it easier and eventually more natural to adopt similar postures on the ground. What began as a feeding posture high in the trees becomes gradually a way of walking between them. In other words, we did not stand up because we left the trees. We may have left the trees because we had already learned to stand. A related idea shifts our focus from how you stand to what you can do with your hands once you're upright. This is the carrying hypothesis. Modern chimpanzees offer a living model here as well. Observers at sites like Bossou in Guinea have documented something striking. When chimps find rare, highly valued foods, certain nuts, or choice fruits, they are much more likely to walk bipedally as they transport them. On two legs, they can carry more objects at once, both hands free, sometimes even adding a mouthful or tucking something with their feet. Bipedal bouts become longer and more frequent when there is something precious to move. For early hominins in patchy landscapes, this mattered. Food might be abundant in one clump of trees and scarce in another. A carcass might be discovered far from shelter. Infants, always vulnerable, needed to be carried while adults foraged or moved. An ancestor who could straighten up and carry more fruit, more meat, more tools, more babies, would have had a quiet advantage. Over time, hip joints, knees and spines that made this posture more comfortable and more stable would be favoured. The carrying hypothesis does not require a wide-open savanna. It works just as well in a broken woodland, where the distance between patches is measured in minutes or hours, not days. It does not require sophisticated stone tools either. Even simple sticks, digging implements, or unmodified food items become easier to transport when your hands are free. Another layer in the stack of ideas is less about what the hands are doing, and more about what the sun is doing. This is the thermoregulation hypothesis. Imagine standing in an open patch at midday millions of years ago. The sun is high, the air thick with heat. If your body is oriented horizontally, like a quadrupedal ape, a large portion of your back is directly exposed to that overhead radiation. more surface area facing the sky, more heat absorbed. If you rotate the same body into a vertical posture, something simple but important changes. The area directly presented to the sun shrinks, your shadow becomes smaller. Less of you is baking at once. At the same time, your head and shoulders are raised higher into the air column, where breezes are slightly faster and cooler. The vertical body acts like a column that heat can flow past up and away. Modelling work suggests that, even with a coat of hair, this shift in posture can significantly reduce heat load during the hottest parts of the day. In a landscape where some foraging and travel happens in more open patches, the individuals who run a little cooler, who can move a little longer before overheating, may gain enough of an edge to matter. Thermoregulation probably did not create bipedalism from scratch. But once upright postures began to appear, heat management could have helped lock them in, making them more advantageous in certain times and places. Then there are ideas that tie locomotion to social life. Provisioning hypotheses suggest that once some individuals could walk efficiently on two legs, they could carry food back to others, mates, offspring, members of their group. This might reinforce pair bonds or cooperative child rearing. In classic versions, often framed in older gendered language, males gather or scavenge and carry resources back to females and infants, increasing the survival of their own offspring. Modern thinking is more cautious about assigning rigid roles, but the core idea remains. Upright walking enhances the ability to share, to move resources from where they are found to where they are needed. Social display hypotheses see another dimension. Among modern apes, standing up can be a way of looking big, of intimidating a rival, of impressing a potential mate. Beating on the chest, throwing objects, swaying and stamping. These are often done from a bipedal stance. If early hominins already had some capacity for upright posture, selection might have favoured those who could hold it longer and more stably during these social performances. Over time, anatomy that supports showy, confident standing could bleed into anatomy that supports everyday walking. These social theories are hard to test directly in the fossil record. Bones do not record who carried food to whom, or which posture impressed which potential partner. They're best seen as possible layers, thin but real, on top of more basic ecological pressures like feeding and heat. When you step back from this forest of explanations, what most researchers now see is not a single towering tree, but a grove. Arboreal feeding behaviours making upright posture familiar in the trees. Patchy, shifting habitats making terrestrial travel more common. The ability to carry food, objects and infants adding value to each upright step. Heat and light in open patches nudging postures toward vertical. Social lives turning standing into a signal as well as a gate. No one of these is a magic key that unlocks the entire story. None of them fits every fossil, every habitat reconstruction, every detail of Lucy's pelvis or Ardy's foot. And the earliest candidates for bipedalism, forms like Sahelanthropus and Orrorin, are fragmentary enough that debates still flare over just how often they were on two legs. So the modern view is quietly humble. Bipedalism did not appear for a single reason, at a single moment. It emerged from a long, tangled interplay of behaviours and environments, stretching over millions of years. Occasional upright feeding in the canopy, short bouts of carrying precious things across the ground, standing tall to look, to cool, to signal. All of these, repeated over countless lifetimes, gradually reshaped spines and hips and feet, turning a part-time posture into a full-time commitment. The price of that commitment, the strain in your lower back, the wear in your knees, the delicate compromise of childbirth, would not be fully paid until much later, when brains swelled and lifestyles changed. But by Lucy's time, the decision had already been made in bone. The next part of the story asks a different question. Once our ancestors were firmly on two legs, what did that do for them? How far could those strange new bodies travel? how efficiently could they cross that patchwork world? To answer that, we have to think not just about why we stood up, but about the energy that flows through each step. If you watch most mammals move, the pattern is simple. They either walk slowly, spending a lot of energy with each step, or they burst into short, explosive sprints, burning through fuel like a match held to dry grass. Humans, by contrast, do something quietly odd. At an easy walking pace, on level ground, our energy use drops into a kind of trough. Per kilogram of body weight for each meter travelled, we burn far less energy than a chimpanzee does, whether that chimp is on all fours or awkwardly upright. Measurements on treadmills suggest that at normal speeds, our walking can cost on the order of 3/4 less than a chimp's bipedal gait. We are, in a sense, long-distance cheapskates. This is not an accident. It's baked into the mechanics of how we move. Imagine watching a person walk, but slow time down until each phase of the step is a separate scene. The heel of the front foot touches down. The leg straightens and stiffens. The body's centre of mass rises slightly as it vaults forward over the planted foot. Then, as we pass over that point, the heel lifts. The body begins to fall forward again, and the other leg swings through to catch the weight. If you trace the path of the body's centre of mass, it moves up and down like a gentle wave. With each step, gravitational potential energy, the energy of being a little higher, is briefly stored, then flows back into forward motion as we fall. Biomechanists often describe this as an inverted pendulum. A normal pendulum, like a clock weight, swings beneath its pivot. Our walking body is the reverse. The mass is on top and the stiff leg is the rod. As we step over that rod, potential and kinetic energy trade places out of phase. When one is high, the other is low. Because of that neat timing, much of the energy that would be lost as heat in a simple stomping gait can be recovered from step to step. Muscles don't have to do all the work from scratch. They can ride the pendulum. On top of this, there are springs. The long Achilles tendon at the back of your ankle stretches as your heel lifts and your calf muscles load it. Then, as you push off, that tendon recoils, returning some of the stored elastic energy. The arches of your feet do something similar, flattening slightly under load and then snapping back. Even ligaments and fascia along the sole participate, tiny biological rubber bands tightening and releasing in rhythm. Put together, the inverted pendulum vault and these elastic tissues make each step surprisingly cheap. Not effortless. Our bodies still burn calories, still heat up, but efficient in a way that stands out among mammals. Chimpanzees, with their shorter hind limbs and more flexed hips and knees, cannot fully use this system. Their legs act more like bent struts. Their centre of mass does not rise and fall in the same clean arc. Their feet lack the same stiff arch and long Achilles tendon. When they are coaxed to walk upright in a lab, they wobble, their muscles firing constantly to keep balance and push the body forward. It costs them. Early hominins like Australopithecus seem to have sat somewhere in between. The Laetoli footprints, left in volcanic ash around 3.6 million years ago, already show a distinct heel strike followed by a push-off from the big toe. The path of pressure through the foot looks in outline very human. Their pelvis and knees indicate a fully upright gait, not a chimp-like waddle. But other parts of the skeleton tell a different story. Shorter legs relative to body size, a more flared pelvis, proportions and muscle attachments that suggest a strong climbing upper body paired with a walking lower body that had not yet reached modern refinement. When researchers build models of Australopithecus walking, or compare their limb proportions to ours, they often conclude that each metre travelled probably cost them more energy than it costs us. Their pendulum worked, but over a shorter arc. Their strides were shorter, their cadence different. They could walk and even run, but not as far as cheaply. In this picture, bipedalism itself evolves in stages. First, an ape that can stand and walk, but at some cost. Then, over millions of years, selection quietly lengthens the legs, deepens the heel, stiffens the arch, tunes the tendons and joints until the gait becomes smoother, cheaper, more automatic. By the time we reach early Homo, around 2 million years ago, that tuning has gone so far that a new possibility begins to open. Running. Here again, humans do something strange. We are not fast in the way gazelles or big cats are fast. A fit sprinter can briefly reach around 10 meters per second. A cheetah can more than double that. Even many quadrupeds of our size can outsprint us easily. And in energy terms, human running is not particularly cheap compared to the running of other mammals. Yet if you lower the speed and stretch the timeline, a different pattern emerges. We're capable of trotting along at moderate paces for astonishing durations, hours in the right conditions, day after day in some traditional hunter-gatherer groups. This pattern lies behind what's known as the endurance running hypothesis. Around 2 million years ago, the fossil record begins to show a shift from Australopithecus to early Homo. Bodies become taller, with longer legs in proportion to the trunk. The feet lose their grasping big toe and become even more specialized as rigid propulsive levers. Toes, especially the lateral ones, shorten, reducing the bending forces and stresses with each running step. Higher up, a tough band of connective tissue called the nuchal ligament appears in the back of the neck. You can feel its modern version if you nod and flex your head. It helps keep the skull from bobbling as the body moves. This is a feature seen in many good running animals and absent or weak in apes that do not run. The gluteus maximus, the big muscle of the buttock, enlarges. In walking it does some work, but in running it becomes crucial, firing powerfully to stabilize the trunk and prevent the torso from pitching forward with each landing. Perhaps most quietly important of all, the skin changes. Our ancestors become remarkably good sweaters. Dense fields of sweat glands combined with relatively little insulating fur give humans an unusual ability to dump heat through evaporation. Quadrupedal predators, panting through their mouths, risk overheating if they run hard for too long in the sun. Bramble and Lieberman, who outlined the endurance running hypothesis, see all of these traits as a package, not perfectly matched to short sprints, but well suited for loping mid-speed runs over long distances, especially in warm climates. What would this have been for? One suggestion is persistence hunting. Imagine an early Homo individual stepping out at dawn in an African mosaic landscape. The air is cool, the light low. A small group moves together, 3, 4, 5 people, eyes searching the ground. They are looking for sign, a cloven hoofprint in damp sand, a tuft of hair on a thorn, a line of disturbed grass. They find the track of an antelope, or maybe a zebra, and begin to follow. At first the animal is far ahead, unseen. It trots, stops to graze, trots again. Each time the humans catch up to the place where it last stood, they read the ground, adjust direction, and keep going. As the sun rises higher, the day warms. The animal, built for bursts of speed, does what it does best when it senses pursuit. It runs hard, fast, putting distance between itself and the unseen followers. But it is wrapped in fur. It cools by panting, exchanging heat through its mouth and lungs. There is a limit to how long it can sustain that pace under a high, hot sun without dangerously overheating. The humans do not try to match that sprint. They jog, then walk, then jog again. Their shoulders and heads stay steady, stabilized by ligaments and muscles. Their legs, long and springy, recycle energy through tendons. Their skin shines with sweat, carrying heat away as it evaporates. They drink when they can. They pace themselves. An hour passes, then 2. Tracks become fresher. Eventually, in some accounts from traditional foragers who still practice versions of this hunt, the animal is found stumbling, panting, its core temperature near collapse. A final, close approach with a spear or club ends the chase. Whether this exact style of persistence hunting was common in early Homo, occasionally used, or relatively rare is still debated. Direct evidence is thin, but the physiology we carry today is undeniably compatible with this strategy. Our strengths are not in explosive power, but in stubborn, steady endurance. That endurance came with trade-offs. By lengthening our legs and refining our feet for efficient walking and running, we sacrifice some of the raw power and four-limbed stability that protect other mammals in close encounters. A human surprised at very short range by a big predator has limited options. We cannot climb as easily as a chimp, cannot bound away like a gazelle, cannot simply outfight a lion or hyena. Our niche instead became distance and timing, covering ground between scattered resources, shadowing herds, arriving first at carcasses, returning loaded with meat or tubers or fruit to a home base. Under this lens, bipedalism is not just standing up, it is a particular energy strategy. Early Australopithecus marked the beginning of that experiment. Competent but still relatively expensive walkers. Later Homo represents a deep refinement, a body turned into a pendulum on springs, capable of crossing a patchwork world with minimal wasted energy, and, when necessary, of turning that walk into a long persistent run. This quiet efficiency is part of why our lineage could spread, first across Africa, then far beyond. It is also part of why the price of our gait is what it is. The spine curved into an S to balance that pendulum, the feet rigidified into arches, the joints squeezed into narrow compromises. To see how far those compromises went, we have to look more closely at the body itself, bone by bone, joint by joint, and trace how an ape frame was rebuilt to carry a walking, running, thinking human. To understand what bipedalism really did to us, it helps to lie still for a moment and imagine your own body as a kind of ancient machine, rebuilt piece by piece over millions of years. We'll start at the top where the story of standing up is written in a single hole. At the base of your skull there is an opening where the spinal cord passes through to meet the brain. In anatomical terms it's called the foramen magnum, literally the great hole. In a quadrupedal ape, that opening sits toward the back of the skull, because the head sticks out in front of the spine like a cantilevered weight. Strong neck muscles, thick nuchal crests, and broad areas of attachment are needed to hold it up and stop it from tipping forward. In a habitual biped, that arrangement becomes inefficient very fast. Over millions of years in our lineage, the foramen magnum crept forward and downward until it ended up more or less underneath the skull, not behind it. If you could hold your own skull in your hands, you'd see that the spine meets it almost like a column under a bowl, not a beam jutting out from a wall. This shift shows up surprisingly early. Fossils like Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus, though debated in detail, seem to have a more anterior downward-facing foramen magnum than living African apes. Not a perfect human configuration, but nudged in that direction, as if evolution had already begun to balance the head over a body that was spending more time upright. Once the head could rest more directly on the spine, the demands on neck muscles changed. Less constant strain to keep the face level with the horizon, less need for massive ridges of bone along the back of the skull. Over time, these heavy supports could slim down. The base of the skull reshaped itself subtly, making room for blood vessels and nerves in slightly different paths, trading brute mechanical leverage for a more efficient centered posture. From there, the forces travel downward into the spine itself. If you picture the vertebral column of a chimpanzee or a gorilla, it is relatively straight, designed for a body that hangs or knuckle walks with the trunk more horizontal. Put that same straight column under a vertical load, and the center of mass would tend to drift in front of the hips. Every step would risk pitching you forward. Our solution was to bend the column. Human spines have a characteristic S-shaped curve, a gentle inward curve in the neck, an outward curve in the upper back, and a pronounced inward curve in the lower back, the lumbar lordosis. This shape is not an aesthetic flourish, it is a balancing act. By curving inward above the pelvis, the lumbar region pulls the upper body's centre of mass back over the hip joints. When you stand quietly, much of your body weight can pass in a near vertical line from head to spine to pelvis to legs. Ligaments and the shapes of the vertebral bodies help to lock that column so that muscles do not have to contract constantly just to keep you from toppling. At the same time, the S-shape acts like a spring. Each step sends a small shock up from the ground. Rather than transmitting that force as a single jolt into the skull, the curves allow the spine to flex and extend slightly, absorbing and dissipating energy, much like the leaf springs on an old carriage. But the spring is imperfect. Those same curves concentrate stress in certain regions. The lower back especially experiences significant compressive and shearing forces. Our lumbar vertebrae are shorter and broader than those of apes, helping to share the load, yet they're still asked to do a lot. Herniated discs, pinched nerves, chronic lumbar pain. These familiar modern complaints are, in a sense, the residue of that compromise. A straight spine would not balance us. A more exaggerated curve would fail under load. Beneath the spine sits the structure that had to change most dramatically, the pelvis. Imagine the pelvis of a chimpanzee, long and narrow, with blade-like iliac bones rising high above the hip joints. This shape suits an animal whose trunk is often pitched forward, whose internal organs are slung like a hammock from the front of the spine. It also allows the powerful gluteal muscles to act mainly as hip extensors, useful for climbing and leaping. Now picture the pelvis of an early biped like Australopithecus, and then of a modern human. The whole unit has been shortened vertically and broadened side to side. The iliac blades curve around to form a kind of basin or bowl. The sacrum at the back has widened, creating a more solid platform under the spine. In an upright body, this bowl does several jobs at once. It supports the abdominal organs, which now largely rest above it instead of hanging in front. It brings the hip joints closer to the body's midline, helping to keep the centre of mass neatly over the feet in single-leg stance. And crucially, it rotates and reshapes the iliac blades so that the main gluteal muscles wrap around to the side of the hip. In you, this means that muscles like the gluteus medius and minimus are no longer just extensors and abductors. They become stabilizers. When you stand on your right leg during a step, these muscles on the right side fire to keep your pelvis from sagging to the left. They hold the basin level, preventing your trunk from swaying wildly with each stride. Without that adaptation, walking on two legs would resemble the rolling side-to-side waddle you sometimes see when a chimp is coaxed to stand. With it, we achieve a comparatively smooth, economical gait. Of course, changing the pelvis alone was not enough. The legs had to be re-aimed. If you watch a chimpanzee walking, the knees stay relatively far apart. The femurs, thigh bones, drop more or less straight down from the hip. That works when your centre of gravity is supported by 4 limbs. But if you're going to spend much of your stride balanced on one foot, those feet need to be tucked in under you. Human femurs are angled. From the hip, they slope inward toward the knee, creating what anatomists call a bicondylar or valgus angle. This geometry brings the knees, and thus the feet, closer to the midline, under the body's centre of mass. During the middle of the step, when only one foot is on the ground, your body is effectively perched on a slightly tilted column. The inward angle allows your weight to pass from hip to knee to ankle, in a line that stays relatively close to your base of support. The result is a stable, pendulum-like transfer from one leg to the other, with only modest muscular effort needed to keep you upright. The trade-off lives inside your knees. That inward angle means that compressive forces across the joint are not distributed perfectly evenly. The joint surfaces, the condyles, are enlarged compared to those in apes, giving more area to handle the stress. Even so, the human knee is a complex hinge asked to bear body weight, manage rotational forces, and keep all of this aligned while you walk, run, and change direction. Osteoarthritis, ligament tears, meniscal injuries. These are the hidden costs of an elegant but highly loaded design. Below the knee, the story continues into the foot, which may have been re-engineered more thoroughly than any other part. The ancestral ape foot is a hand-like structure, flexible, with a divergent big toe capable of grasping branches. The midfoot can bend, allowing the animal to cling, clamp, and climb. If you try to walk long distances on such a foot, each step would waste energy as the structure flexed under load and had to be actively stabilized. Over time, our lineage traded gripping for ground. The big toe swung inward, aligning with the other toes to form a single forward-pointing row. The small bones of the midfoot fused and stiffened relative to those of apes. Across the sole, longitudinal arches developed, curving from heel to ball, and, to a lesser degree, transverse arches from side to side. A thick band of connective tissue, the plantar fascia, stretches under these arches like the string of a bow. When you step, the heel strikes first, then the weight rolls along the lateral side of the foot before crossing inward toward the big toe. As the arch flattens slightly, the plantar fascia and associated ligaments stretch, storing elastic energy. At push-off, they recoil, helping to lift the heel and propel the body forward. The foot, once a soft, adaptable hand, has become a rigid lever with built-in springs. Loss of the grasping big toe meant a reduction in climbing finesse, but it also allowed a more forceful push-off and a stable platform for balance. The same structures that let your ancestors cover long distances now predispose some of us to problems like plantar fasciitis, fallen arches, and stress fractures when loaded in modern, sometimes mismatched ways. As all of this changed, the skull base, spine, pelvis, legs, feet, the rest of the skeleton quietly rearranged itself to keep pace. The ribcage shifted from a funnel shape, narrow at the top and broad at the bottom as in many apes, toward a more barrel-like form. This brought the center of mass closer to the spine and allowed the shoulders to rotate outward to the sides. Freed from the duty of bearing weight in quadrupedal locomotion, the arms could swing as counterbalances when we walk, smoothing out each step and helping to conserve momentum. The shoulders, now more laterally placed, set the stage for something new. Arms that could throw, manipulate, and carry rather than prop the body up. Over time, the arms themselves shortened relative to the legs. Hands became shorter and broader, with robust thumbs capable of precise opposition. Fingers lost some of their curvature. The costs were paid in decreased arboreal agility. The benefits emerged in tool-making, fire-tending, weaving, and all the other fine manipulations that would come to define human technology. By the time you arrive back at your own resting body, you're lying inside the result of all these small shifts and trade-offs. A skull balanced on a column balanced on a bowl supported by angled struts ending in stiff spring-loaded platforms. Each part carries echoes of an arboreal past and hints of the compromises that upright life required, and each part will play a role in the pains and risks that came with this new posture. To see those costs clearly, we have to look where two of these evolutionary projects collide. In the narrow ring of bone where a bipedal pelvis meets an enlarging brain. The ring of bone we call the pelvis was not just reshaped to hold you up. It was also reshaped to let new humans pass through. Those two jobs do not fit together neatly. This is where we meet one of the most dramatic trade-offs in our entire evolutionary story, a problem biologists sometimes call the obstetric dilemma. On one side is the demand for a pelvis that works well for walking, relatively narrow, with the hip joints tucked under the body, the sacrum broad but not wildly flared, the whole structure optimized to channel forces from spine to legs. On the other side is the demand for babies with big brains and big skulls. Put those together, and you get a difficulty that almost every human lineage has had to face. How do you give birth through a canal designed for locomotion when the passenger's head keeps getting larger? To feel the tension, imagine an early biped like Australopithecus, Lucy's kind, walking across a patchwork landscape of woodland and open ground. Her pelvis is already shortened and widened to support upright posture. The birth canal runs through that basin like a curved tunnel, defined by bone in the front and back and muscular walls to the sides. For a long time, in our deeper primate past, that tunnel was roomy enough. Ape infants, even with decent-sized brains, could pass through with relatively little drama. Their birth canals are more uniformly shaped, the path straighter. The babies are smaller relative to the mother's body. In our lineage, two things happened at once. The pelvis continued to adjust for better bipedal efficiency, iliac blades wrapping around, the sacrum widening, the whole basin becoming a firm platform under the spine. At the same time, in later Australopiths and early Homo, brain size began its slow but steady climb. Skulls grew taller and rounder, faces tucked under the brain case. The ratio between infant size and maternal size crept upward until, in modern humans, a newborn typically weighs around 6% of the mother's mass, roughly double the proportion you see in a gorilla. The result is a fit that is almost uncomfortably perfect. In many women, the baby's head and shoulders are only just small enough to navigate the passage, a few millimeters either way, and labour can stall. Anthropologists call that cephalopelvic disproportion, and in a world without surgery it has always been dangerous. You can hear the traces of this in the mechanics of human birth itself. If you watch a chimpanzee give birth, not a restful image but a revealing one, you see that the baby usually passes through the birth canal facing forward, toward the mother's belly. The path is more or less straight. The infant's head does not have to twist and turn dramatically to find its way out. Human births are different. Inside the mother's pelvis, the upper opening of the canal and the lower opening are oriented at almost right angles to each other. The inlet is widest from side to side. The outlet down near the perineum is widest from front to back. The canal in between curves like a gentle S. To pass through this changing geometry, the human fetus performs a kind of slow-motion dance. As the head enters the inlet, it usually aligns sideways, so the widest part of the skull matches the widest part of the opening. As it descends, it rotates, turning so that by the time it reaches the outlet, the face is usually oriented toward the mother's back. The shoulders have to follow with their own rotation, one dropping slightly ahead of the other to thread through the narrowest point. This sequence, engagement, flexion, internal rotation, extension, does not happen consciously. It is the outcome of shapes colliding, the curves of bone, the compressible but not infinitely flexible skull, the push of uterine contractions. It is also awkward for a solitary mother. Because the baby usually emerges facing away from her, it is mechanically difficult for a labouring woman to guide the infant's head, clear the cord if it wraps, or ease the shoulders out without assistance. In many other primates, the mother can reach down and help even lift the baby to her chest immediately. In humans, the geometry is less cooperative. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this difficulty left a mark not just on bodies, but on behaviour. There's growing evidence that humans are, in a very literal sense, adapted to give birth with help. Across cultures, and likely deep into prehistory, women rarely laboured entirely alone when they had any choice in the matter. Older relatives, experienced midwives, sometimes even male partners. Someone was usually present, watching, ready to support, catch, adjust, encourage. In small Pleistocene camps around a fire, where evening shadows gathered and predators watched from the dark, the birth of a child would not have been a hidden, isolated event. It was a social moment, surrounded by hands and eyes. The risks of obstructed labour, hemorrhage or shock made that collective vigilance a matter of life or death, for mother, for infant, and for the group that depended on both. But if the passage is so tight, why not just make the pelvis bigger? This is where the story gets even more complex, and recent research has begun to add new layers. The old picture drew a straight line. Bipedalism demands a narrow pelvis. Big brains demand a wide one. Evolution splits the difference, and we suffer the consequences. There is some truth there. A very broad pelvis might indeed alter walking mechanics, increasing the energetic cost of locomotion, or putting odd stresses on the hips and lower back. Yet when scientists have modelled different pelvic shapes, the constraints do not seem to be purely mechanical. Some women with relatively wide pelves walk perfectly efficiently. Some primates that are not bipeds also face fairly tight fits during birth. That has led to what's sometimes called the metabolic hypothesis. According to this view, the limit on how long a human fetus can stay in the womb, and how large its brain can grow before birth, is set less by the width of the canal and more by the mother's energy budget. Late in pregnancy, human mothers are running near the top of what their bodies can sustainably support. Growing brain tissue is expensive. Past a certain point, continuing the pregnancy would require more calories and metabolic throughput than the mother can safely provide. Birth, in this picture, is triggered when the fetus has reached the largest size the mother's physiology can support, not just the largest size that can squeeze through bone. These two ideas are not mutually exclusive. The dimensions of the pelvis, the demands of walking, and the limits of metabolism all converge on the same bottleneck. A baby that must be born before it becomes too costly, but after it has developed enough to survive outside. The compromise evolution arrived at has a quiet, everyday consequence. Human infants are born astonishingly helpless. Compared to other great apes, our newborns have much less of their adult brain size at birth. Only about a quarter, where a chimpanzee or gorilla baby might arrive with closer to half. Their necks are weak. Their motor control is minimal. They cannot cling to their mother's fur and ride along. They must be carried, supported, watched constantly. Biologists sometimes call this secondary ultriciality. We are not like baby birds hatched in a nest with no feathers, but we echo that vulnerability in mammalian form. Much of our brain growth, and with it our cognitive development, is pushed into the outside world. Instead of finishing that construction in the quiet darkness of the womb, we complete it while being rocked, sung to, handed from parent to grandparent to older sibling. This too has shaped our societies. A child who cannot move independently for months, who needs years before they can feed themselves reliably, is a heavy burden for one adult to bear alone. In small foraging bands on ancient floodplains and forest edges, the solution was not simply stronger mothers, but more cooperative groups. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated allies, all could participate in food provisioning, carrying, and guarding. Some anthropologists think this long dependent childhood, made longer by that early constrained birth, created a window for something else to flourish. Learning. A brain that continues to grow rapidly outside the womb is plastic, open to experience. Long before cities, schools, or writing, this meant years of watching, imitating, listening to stories. Culture could accumulate. Skills could compound over generations. The very difficulty of getting big-brained babies safely into the world may have nudged our species toward deeper cooperation, more elaborate kinship, more structured roles like midwives and healers. The cries of a woman in labour, echoing off cave walls or drifting through acacia groves, would bring others running not just out of compassion, but because their own survival was bound up with hers. So in that narrow ring of bone, the pelvis that holds you upright and the canal that lets the next generation through are locked in a delicate truce. Bipedalism demanded a stable, efficient frame for walking. Encephalization, the growth of our elaborate energy-hungry brains, demanded larger infants and long postnatal growth. Where those demands meet, we see the marks of compromise, the twisting passage of human birth, the risk of obstructed labour, the necessity of assistance, the helplessness of our newborns, the density of our social bonds, and even here, in this intimate space of bones and blood and breath, the story of trade-offs is not finished. The same pelvic architecture that makes birth so challenging is also part of the structure that will carry you, day after day, across hard modern floors and city streets. To see how that ancient compromise still shapes the aches in your hips, the strain in your lower back, and the sharp twinge in your knees when you climb the stairs, we have to step back from the cradle and look again at the whole upright machine, and the price it continues to exact. The price shows up first for many people in the quiet ache of the lower back. You can feel it when you've been standing a little too long in a grocery line, or after a day of lifting boxes, or sometimes for no clear reason at all. A dull, insistent weight just above the hips, as if something deep inside the spine were complaining in a language of stiffness and heat. That feeling is not an accident. It is the legacy of a very specific shape. When our ancestors committed to walking upright, their spines had to perform a balancing act no other primate spine quite manages. Instead of running like a simple arch from neck to pelvis, the human backbone bends and counterbends. In the lower region, the lumbar vertebrae curve inward, creating the familiar S shape that keeps your head poised over your center of gravity. That curve is what lets you stand comfortably without toppling forward. It stacks the torso over the hips, allowing the pelvis and legs to bear the body's mass. But it also concentrates forces. Each time you stand, walk, or lift, gravity pushes your upper body down. The lumbar curve must redirect that force through small pads of cartilage, the intervertebral discs, and through bony joints at the back of the vertebrae. Compressive forces squeeze the discs. Shear forces try to slide one vertebra forward on another. Over millions of steps and decades of life, those stresses add up. Sometimes the outer wall of a disc weakens and the soft inner material bulges or leaks out, pressing on nerves. Doctors call that a herniated disc. Sometimes a vertebra slips forward relative to the one below it, a condition known as spondylolisthesis. More often, there is no single dramatic event, just slow degeneration, thinning discs, overgrown bone at the joints, the gradual stiffening of a column that was built to flex. By middle age, many people carry these changes in their lumbar spines even if they feel only occasional twinges. For a large fraction of us, that twinge becomes more than occasional. Studies suggest that somewhere between 60 and 80% of humans will experience significant lower back pain at some point in their lives. For about 1 in 10 adults, it becomes chronic, lasting for months or years. Across the planet, this quiet misery has become one of the leading causes of disability. Yet from an evolutionary point of view, the system is not entirely broken. Most of our ancestors didn't live into their 80s. A spine that holds together reasonably well through the peak reproductive years may be good enough for natural selection, even if it groans a bit in later decades. The price is paid most heavily in the second half of life, when evolution's grip on our anatomy grows looser. The same story plays out a little farther down, at the knees. To walk efficiently on 2 legs, your feet must land almost directly under your center of mass. If your legs simply dropped straight down from the hip sockets, like stilts, your feet would splay out to the sides. Every step would waste energy swaying and correcting. Instead, human thigh bones angle inward from hip to knee. This valgus angle brings the knees under the pelvis and keeps the line of force centered with each step. You can see it clearly if you watch someone walk from behind. The knees are closer together than the hips. The lower legs then drop almost straight to the ankles. It is an elegant solution, but again, it has a cost. The knee is not a simple hinge. It is a complex, twisting joint, held together by a web of ligaments and cushioned by crescent-shaped pads of cartilage called menisci. Every time the foot strikes the ground, forces travel up the shin into this structure. Because of the inward angle of the femur, those forces are not perfectly symmetrical. The inner compartment of the knee, on the side closer to the other leg, often carries more load. Over decades, that uneven loading can wear away the smooth cartilage that coats the joint surfaces. The bones underneath respond by thickening and reshaping. The result is osteoarthritis, a grinding, stiffening disease that makes standing from a chair or climbing a hill feel like a negotiation. In younger, more active bodies, the weak points are different. Sudden twists, pivots, or awkward landings can overwhelm the ligaments that hold the joint in place. The anterior cruciate ligament, the ACL, runs deep inside the knee, preventing the shin bone from sliding forward. When it snaps, as it often does in sports that demand quick changes of direction, the joint can become unstable for life, even after surgery. Once again, we see the same pattern. A joint finely tuned for balancing a vertical body, but always one misstep away from strain, tear, or slow erosion. Higher up, at the junction of trunk and legs, the hips carry their own burden. The bowl-shaped pelvis that supports our viscera and anchors our spine also forms deep sockets on either side, the acetabular, where the heads of the femurs fit. In a walking human, those ball and socket joints have to bear forces that can be several times body weight with every stride. When you run, jump, or carry loads, the numbers climb. To handle that, our hip joints became large and robust. The femoral heads expanded, the necks thickened, the surrounding muscles grew powerful, but cartilage, no matter how smooth and springy, has limits. It is living tissue, but with very limited ability to repair itself. In many quadrupedal animals, the hips do not see the same combination of vertical loading and lifespan that we do. Their weighted spread across 4 limbs. Their evolutionary history did not demand that the pelvis double as both a cradle for abdominal organs and the primary bridge from spine to ground. In humans, the hip is one of the places where those compromises converge. After 50 or 60 years of service, the cartilage may thin, crack, or disappear in patches. The underlying bone becomes exposed, polishing itself against its partner in the socket. Pain in the groin or outer hip, stiffness and reduced mobility follow, the familiar picture of hip osteoarthritis. So far, we have talked about the big, obvious joints. But the price of standing is written even more delicately in the small bones and soft tissues of the foot. If you could look at the foot of a distant ancestor like Ardipithecus, you would see something surprisingly hand-like. A flexible midfoot, long curved toes, and a big toe that still helped grasp branches. Over time, as our lineage committed to the ground, that design was almost completely reworked. The midfoot stiffened into a firm arch, better at transmitting forces from heel to toes. Ligaments bound the bones together into a springy bridge. The big toe swung forward to line up with the others, transforming from a hook into a lever for push-off. This turned a grasping organ into a rigid weight-bearing platform, a living suspension bridge that supports the body with every step. When it all holds together, the system is remarkably efficient. When small parts begin to fail, the consequences can ripple upward. If the arches collapse or never fully form, the foot rolls inward with each stride. Flat feet can alter the alignment of the knees and hips, changing how forces travel through the entire limb. If the band of tissue under the sole, the plantar fascia, gets overstressed, tiny tears can accumulate. The heel becomes a node of burning pain, a condition plenty of modern walkers know by name, plantar fasciitis. Shoes that squeeze the toes or shift weight forward onto the ball of the foot encourage another familiar deformity. Over years, the big toe may drift toward its neighbours, the joint at its base swelling and angling outward. The bunion that forms is more than a bump. It is a sign that the mechanics of the forefoot have been pushed past what their evolutionary history prepared them for. Even the small metatarsal bones can crack under repeated stress. March fractures, often seen in soldiers and runners, are the skeleton's quiet protest against thousands of impacts on hard, unyielding surfaces. Standing upright does not just challenge our bones and cartilage, it reshapes how fluids and organs move through us. In a quadruped, blood returning from the limbs to the heart does not have to climb a tall vertical column. In us, the veins in the legs must carry blood upward against gravity, using one-way valves and the squeezing action of muscles to keep the column from sagging back down. Over time, if those valves weaken or the vein wall stretch, blood can pool. Vessels twist and bulge under the skin as varicose veins. For some people, they are mostly a cosmetic annoyance. For others, they ache, itch, or progress to more serious venous insufficiency, with swelling and skin changes that are harder to ignore. Inside the abdomen and pelvis, gravity exerts a different kind of pull. Our organs rest on a muscular floor, layers of tissue strung like a hammock between the bones of the pelvis. That hammock has to resist downward pressure from intestines, bladder, uterus, and the everyday strains of coughing, lifting, even simply standing. When weak spots appear, loops of intestine can push through the abdominal wall as hernias. In the pelvis, especially after childbirth or with age, organs may sag or shift, leading to pelvic floor disorders, prolapse, incontinence, a sense of heaviness that is as much mechanical as it is subjective. Other mammals experience some of these problems, but our particular combination of tall stature, upright posture, and long lifespans makes them unusually common. Again and again, we see the same theme. Tissues that evolved under one set of loads now working at the edge of their tolerance. At the end of this long chain of compromises stands perhaps the starkest cost of all, the risk of falling. Bipedalism turns the body into an inverted pendulum balanced on two small platforms. To stay upright, your nervous system must constantly integrate signals from the inner ear, the eyes, and tiny sensors in muscles and joints. Micro-adjustments in ankle, knee, hip, and spine happen every second, usually below conscious awareness. When those systems are young and well-tuned, the balancing act feels simple. You can stroll along a forest path, step over roots, descend a rocky slope, and rarely think about the complex calculations happening beneath your awareness. As we age, the senses grow noisier. Vision dims, the inner ear stiffens, muscles lose power, reaction times slow. The margin for error narrows. A small slip on a wet stone or an uneven curb can send an older body to the ground. In many modern societies, falls have become the leading cause of injury-related death in older adults. In some countries, about 1 in 4 people over 65 reports falling at least once a year. Hip fractures, wrist fractures, head injuries. These are not rare, freak accidents, but predictable consequences of walking through the world on two increasingly unreliable pillars. For our ancestors, living in landscapes of loose stones, hidden burrows, and shifting mud, the stakes would have been similarly high. A badly broken leg in a Pleistocene valley might mean not just pain, but starvation, predation, or dependence on others for months. So when you feel the soft tug of fatigue in your back at the end of a day, or the faint creak in your knees as you stand, or notice the faint blue tracery of veins on your calves, you're hearing a quiet echo of millions of years of trade-offs. Bipedalism gave our lineage free hands, far-seeing eyes, and the endurance to cross continents. But it did not come cheaply. It twisted our spines into fragile curves, angled our knees into stressed hinges, turned grasping feet into levers that sometimes crack, and stacked our organs and blood in a tall column that forever strains against gravity. And modern life, with its hard floors, sedentary hours and long lifespans, has not made the bargain easier. To understand how our present habits amplify these ancient vulnerabilities, we have to take one more step forward, from the savannas and woodlands of deep time into the paved, padded, chair-filled world we inhabit now, where the old design is still at work, but the environment has changed faster than evolution can follow. Imagine taking that carefully re-engineered, slightly fragile, beautifully efficient bipedal body that emerged on mixed woodland and grassland, and dropping it into a world of padded chairs, tight shoes, and endless flat stone. That is essentially what the last few centuries have done. For almost all of our history, being human meant moving, not sprinting marathons every day, but walking, squatting, carrying, climbing, bending. Long, easy miles over dirt, grass, sand, leaf litter, soft river banks, forest duff, uneven ground that made the foot and leg adjust with every step, spreading the load across bone, ligament, and muscle in subtly different ways. Our ancestors did not have ergonomic chairs. They had logs, rocks, and the ground. When they rested, they tended to squat or kneel or sit cross-legged, positions that still ask the hips, knees, and trunk muscles to do some work. The core and glutes stayed awake. Now picture a typical modern day. Hours in a car, hours in a chair, hours on a couch. Many of us spend more of our waking lives folded into a right angle than standing or walking. From an evolutionary medicine perspective, this is a classic mismatch. A body tuned for a frequent, varied, low-intensity movement living in a built environment that rewards stillness. The skeleton and its supporting tissues are the same. The forces acting on them have changed. When you sit, especially in a soft chair, certain muscles slacken. The big gluteal muscles at the back of the hips, those thick pads of power that help push you forward and keep your pelvis level with each step, are literally taken out of the equation. The hip flexors at the front shorten. The deep abdominal muscles that help shore up the lumbar curve are no longer needed to keep you upright. The chair's backrest volunteers for that job. Hour after hour, day after day, the nervous system quietly adapts. Muscles that not used shrink and forget how to fire in sequence. Clinicians sometimes call this dormant butt syndrome, a slightly comic name for a serious shift in how forces travel through the body. When the glutes stop playing their full role as shock absorbers and stabilizers, other structures must pick up the slack. Often, that someone else is the lower back. Remember the S-shaped spine, delicately redirecting forces through its curves and discs. In an active walker, the glutes and core muscles help hold the pelvis steady, so the lumbar vertebrae are not asked to damp every jolt alone. In a habitual sitter, the pelvis tends to tip forward or back, the lumbar curve either exaggerated or flattened, and those small supporting muscles along the spine weaken. Then, when you do stand, or lift, or twist to reach something, the load falls more suddenly on a column that has been deconditioned. Over years, the odds of pain rise. Population studies that look at sedentary time and spinal discomfort see the pattern. The more hours people spend sitting, especially in fixed, flexed postures, the more often necks and backs protest. The ancient compromise that made our spine good enough for a life of walking and bending becomes less good when we remove the walking and keep the bending. The same mismatch appears a little farther down at the place where flesh meets world, the feet. For millions of years our lineage walked mostly barefoot, or with only thin layers of leather or plant fibre between skin and soil. The arch, that living suspension bridge, was not a rigid block. It flexed and recoiled against compliant ground. The intrinsic foot muscles, small bands of tissue between the metatarsals and toes, helped shape the arch on the fly, responding to each patch of earth. Modern footwear changes that conversation. Many contemporary shoes are stiff along the sole, heavily cushioned under the heel, and sometimes tipped so that the heel sits higher than the forefoot. For fashion, the effect can be extreme. High heels that pitch the body forward, cramming toes into narrow boxes and shifting much of the body's weight onto the ball of the foot. Even more sensible-looking shoes can mute the work the foot would naturally do. Thick cushioning and rigid soles absorb some of the forces that would otherwise be managed by the arch and its muscles. Over time, muscles that are not asked to work as hard do what muscles always do. They weaken. Studies that place people in more minimalist, barefoot-like shoes for a few weeks or months find something telling. The small intrinsic muscles, now recruited more fully, grow stronger and larger. The system remembers how to act like a foot rather than a padded stump. None of this means modern shoes are purely bad. They can protect from sharp objects, cold and extreme surfaces for which we were never designed. And researchers still debate how different shoe types affect injuries like plantar fasciitis or stress fractures. But the general pattern is clear. When we immobilize or overcushion a structure that evolved to flex, spring and feel, we change how forces move through it and up the chain. Then there is the ground itself. Our feet, knees and hips took shape under conditions of variability. A step onto soft sand, then firmer dirt, then a protruding root. Each stride placed the heel, arch, and toes in slightly different angles and depths. Each impact was spread out by the yielding nature of soil and vegetation. In cities and many towns today, that world has been paved over. Sidewalks, asphalt, tile floors, shopping mall corridors, warehouse concrete, flat, hard, unyielding. Instead of a constantly shifting pattern of impacts, the body receives almost identical shocks, again and again, on the same parts of the heel and forefoot. The knees and hips feel the echoes. The lumbar spine above them absorbs the remainders. For many people, especially those who stand or walk all day on these artificial planes, factory workers, nurses, retail staff, the mismatch is obvious at the end of a shift. Throbbing heels, aching knees, a dull pull in the low back. For others, the signals are quieter but cumulative, woven into the slow development of joint changes over decades. Layered on top of all this is another difference between our world and that of our ancestors: body mass. The upright posture already focuses weight through a relatively small number of joints: ankles, knees, hips, lumbar vertebrae. When total body mass increases, particularly around the abdomen, the compressive force through those joints climbs as well. In large surveys, rates of knee pain and osteoarthritis rise dramatically with higher body weight. The same is true, more subtly, for low back and foot pain. Sometimes pain reduces movement, and reduced movement then makes weight gain more likely, creating loops that are as social and psychological as they are mechanical. Again, evolution's good enough calculation did not anticipate this. Our foraging, farming, and early urban ancestors certainly experienced periods of surplus, but the combination of constant food availability, high-calorie diets, and widespread sedentary work is very new. The bipedal frame can handle extra load, but only up to a point. Beyond that, the already stressed knees and hips, the already compromised discs and arches, begin to fail earlier and more often. forest trail with roots and stone spaced just far enough apart to keep the foot and brain alert. These are, in a sense, the landscapes our anatomy still expects. None of this turns us back into Paleolithic foragers. The modern world, with its chairs and shoes and concrete, is here to stay. But awareness softens the edges. Instead of seeing pain as a random malfunction, we can recognize in it the faint outline of deep time. A spine that learned to bear a head under open skies, a foot that adapted from branch to savanna, a pelvis shaped by both walking and birth. When you take a slow walk tomorrow, or stand to stretch after sitting, you're not just doing an exercise. You're allowing an ancient machine to operate in conditions a little closer to the ones it was built for. You are, in a small, quiet way, easing the mismatch between the world of your ancestors and the world of desks and pavements, and those small adjustments, multiplied over years, can change how the story of bipedalism feels in your own body as the tale moves from deep past into the unfinished chapter that is your life. So we've spent a while with the costs, the aching backs, the tricky births, the knees that complain on stairs, the feet that throb on concrete. But if our ancestors could somehow look forward and see you walking down a lit street, or tapping on a glass rectangle, or turning the pages of a book, they might think something very different. They might think, this is what all that pain brought. Because when our lineage tipped up onto two legs, it didn't just change how we moved. It quietly rewired what we could do with our bodies, our minds, and each other. Start with the obvious trade that every early biped made step by step across those ancient woodlands and patchy grasslands. 4 legs down to 2. Front feet freed into hands. For millions of years after that first uncertain upright stride, those hands still looked, in many ways, like ape hands. Long fingers, strong grips, good for branches and for pulling fruit toward the mouth. But now they no longer had to help carry body weight with every step. The demands on them changed. Over time, so did the bones and the brain circuits that controlled them. By about 2.6 million years ago, somewhere in East Africa, members of the genus Homo were doing something no primate had done before on that scale. They were taking stones, striking them at careful angles, and producing sharp-edged flakes on purpose. Older one tools, simple to us, but revolutionary then. To hit one stone with another in just the right way, you need more than strength. You need controlled wrist rotation, precision pinch grips, and the ability to picture the flake you want before it exists. Fast forward 1 million years or so, and other hominins, likely Homo erectus or close relatives, are shaping Acheulean hand axes. Symmetrical teardrop-shaped tools chipped on both sides, often with a level of regularity that suggests not just dexterity, but teaching, copying, and maybe even a sense of aesthetic preference. This did not happen overnight. It was the slow bloom of a system where hind limbs did most of the carrying, and forelimbs could specialize in manipulation. Inside the skull, motor areas that control hand movements began to occupy more neural real estate. Modern neuroscience finds that some of these regions break complex tool use down into small, reusable building blocks of movement. Turn, pinch, pull, twist. Those same building blocks now let you write a sentence, thread a needle, type on a keyboard, or swipe to silence an alarm. All of that rests on a much older foundation. An ape that stood up and told its hands, "You're free. Do something with it." Freed hands also changed something quieter but just as important: how we carried things and who we became responsible for. A quadrupedal ape mother has options. An infant can ride on her back clinging to fur or tuck underneath. In a fully upright walker, much of the body's balance is stacked over the hips. The front of the torso becomes a natural shelf. Anthropologists studying infant carrying point out that human babies are often held facing in, chest to chest, or on the hip, where the caregiver's arms and torso support them. Imagine one of those early hominin mothers Moving across a sun-dappled clearing, her hands are no longer needed to support her own weight. They can cradle a helpless infant for hours. The baby's face is just inches from hers. Eyes meet. Expressions flicker back and forth. Vocalizations experiment in that small space between mouths. This close, prolonged, face-to-face carrying may have been one of the quiet forces nudging our species toward longer childhoods, tighter social bonds, and more elaborate communication. A baby that spends years being transported against a caregiver's chest or hip is bathed in eye contact, gesture, tone of voice, and the subtle shifts of posture that signal mood and intention. Those signals became more visible as the whole group stood upright, an upright body as a tall flag of information. When your ancestors walked across open ground, their heads were lifted above the level of shrubs and grasses. They could see each other's faces from farther away. They could see where someone else was looking. Humans today have unusually visible eyes for a primate. The white sclera makes gaze direction easy to read. In a group of upright walkers, that matters. A quick glance toward a patch of brush might mean, there's food, or there's danger. A slight tilt of the head, a shift in stance, a raised hand, all can be seen over a distance in a way that is harder when bodies are low and faces pointed at the ground. One line of research calls this the cooperative eye system, eyes and body language tuned for collaboration. It likely co-evolved with the kinds of cooperative foraging and hunting that bipeds made possible. You can picture a small band of early Homo on a savanna edge, spread out but still keeping each other in view. One person spots a herd, a flick of the eyes, a lifted arm, a leaning of the torso, and the others quietly attune. Out of such moments, over and over across thousands of generations, something like our modern social world took shape. Bipedalism did not cause cooperation all by itself, but by lifting eyes and hands and faces into a shared plane, it made new degrees of coordination possible. It also opened the door to a different kind of food, and with it, a different kind of brain. Walking on two legs is not fast, but in humans it is efficient. At moderate speeds, the energy cost of walking a given distance is low compared to many other mammals. Later, in the genus Homo, our bodies acquired traits that also support endurance running. Long tendons, a nuchal ligament to steady the head, sweat glands for cooling. There is debate about exactly how often our ancestors used these abilities for persistence hunting, trotting after prey under the hot sun until the animal overheated, or for long-distance scavenging, reaching carcasses before other competitors. What seems likely is that the combination of efficient walking and eventually endurance running made it easier to secure animal foods over wide areas. Meat, marrow, brains, dense packets of calories and nutrients. According to what biologists call the expensive tissue hypothesis, a shift toward higher quality foods allowed the gut to shrink somewhat. Digestion became less costly, and the freed energy could be invested in something metabolically hungry, a growing brain. Between early Australopiths and later Homo, brain volume expanded dramatically. Not in a single leap, and certainly not for a single reason, but in a series of increments linked to diet, social complexity and technology. Bipedal locomotion, by making endurance foraging practical, may have been one of the key steps on that staircase. From there, the distances only grew. Our remodeled hips and knees, our springy arches and long Achilles tendons turned us into a species that could walk and walk and walk. Over generations, bands of Homo sapiens followed rivers and coasts, grassland corridors and forest edges, out of Africa and into Southwest Asia, across Eurasia, down into Southeast Asia and Australia, up into the cold north, later across land bridges into the Americas. Each individual journey was modest, a day's walk to a new patch of grass, a season's slow shift along a shoreline. But over tens of thousands of years, those small steps wrote lines across the globe. If you look at a modern map with that in mind, coastlines and mountain passes and river valleys, become stories of feet, bare feet on volcanic ash in Laetoli, feet wrapped in hide crossing some ice age plain, feet today on a suburban sidewalk or a hospital corridor, carrying forward the same basic pattern: heel strike, roll through the arch, push off with the toes, and yet, for all this success, our two-legged design is not finished. Evolution has no final draft. The spinal curves that sometimes compress, the pelvis that still struggles to balance birth and bipedalism, the knees that wear down on hard, flat surfaces, these are not mistakes in a blueprint. They are evidence of trade-offs that worked well enough in one world and are now being tested in another. Right now, as you listen, small variations are at work in human populations. Differences in hip shape, in the angle of the femur, in the robustness of vertebrae and the architecture of the foot. Some of those variations make certain people a little more resistant to back pain, or a little less prone to knee damage, or better able to bear children safely. Natural selection still touches these traits, though the pressures are gentler and more tangled with culture than they were on a Pleistocene plain. You are, in other words, not the endpoint of bipedal evolution, but a chapter, a draft among many. If you let your attention drift now to your own body, you might feel that history in miniature. The weight of your head, balanced on the top of the spine, the soft pull of gravity along the S-curve, whether you're lying down, sitting, or standing. The way your hips feel, the quiet presence of your knees, the outline of your feet against whatever surface supports them. Every time you stand up to get a glass of water, or walk slowly down a hallway at night, your nervous system is running ancient programs. Stabilize the pelvis, align the knees, roll through the arches. Muscles fire in a sequence refined over millions of years, from Ardi's awkward steps on forest floor to Lucy's confident stride through East African light, to the long migrations of Homo across continents. You don't have to think about any of it. That is the gift. But if you choose for a moment, you can feel the connection. The way a simple act, shifting your weight from one foot to the other, links you to an unbroken chain of walkers behind you. A chain that stretches back through the last ice age, through the great bottleneck that almost erased us, through the branching of hominin species, all the way to that hazy time when some ape-like creature first leaned back from its knuckles and tried a new way of moving. That experiment is still running. It runs every time a child takes a first wobbly step and the room holds its breath. It runs in the triumph of that step and in the stumble that follows. It runs in the ease of a pain-free walk and in the twinge that makes you slow down and listen. Somewhere in that mix of risk and possibility is the real story of why we walk on two legs. Not a single neat reason, but a long layered bargain, hands freed to shape the world, minds fed and grown on the fruits of endurance, eyes and gestures made for cooperation, bodies capable of carrying us across the face of the planet. And you, wherever you are right now, are part of it. Every step you have ever taken, from crib to kitchen to the path outside your door, is a tiny echo of that first uncertain stride in deep time, still rippling forward into the unfinished future. So as you lie there now, feeling your own spine settle and your breathing slow, you're carrying all of that with you. The forest shadows where something like Sahelanthropus may or may not have tested those first upright steps. The mixed world of Ardi, half tree, half ground, Lucy's clear imprint in the Laetoli ash, the long, dry corridors where Homo turned slow, efficient walking into a way to cross continents, the narrow pelvis that makes birth a careful negotiation, the sore lower back after a long day on modern concrete. From ancient forest floors to city streets lit at midnight, bipedalism has been both our greatest adaptation and our most intimate vulnerability. It is the reason your hands are free to hold a book or a phone and also the reason your knees sometimes ache on the stairs. The same S-shaped spine that balances your head so elegantly is the one that can pinch a nerve and send pain down your leg. The story we've traced tonight isn't finished. It isn't even tidy. Every few years, a new fossil comes out of the ground, part of a femur, a skull, a single toe bone, and the timeline shifts a little. One team's 3D analysis says, this was an early biped. Another team looks again and says, maybe not. Maybe it climbed more than it walked. Arguments flare over Sahelanthropus, over whether Lucy is our ancestor or a cousin, over how many different hominins were sharing the landscape at once. Far from being a problem, that uncertainty is the pulse of the science. It's how we know the story's alive. Each new CT scan, each new method for measuring bone growth or developmental timing adds another clue. Sometimes it supports an old idea. Sometimes it undercuts it. More often, it complicates everything, and we have to redraw the picture in our heads. Early bipedalism stops looking like a clean ladder and starts to look like a braided river, channels splitting and rejoining, side streams drying out, others carving new paths. You're listening in the middle of that process, not at the end of it. If you'd like to stay with this story as it changes, walk a little further with it. You can gently tap like or leave a comment. If you feel like sharing, you might write where you're listening from. A bedroom in a high-rise, a dorm room, a farmhouse miles from the nearest streetlight. All of those places reached in a way on foot. You can say what part of this journey stayed with you. Was it the Litoli footprints? The tight squeeze of birth? The idea that your backache is a whisper from deep time? If you want more nights like this, you can subscribe, so the next walk through deep time is waiting for you when you need it. And if you'd ever like to support this little project more directly, there's a channel membership you can join. It helps me keep digging into these stories, but it's completely optional. Your presence here, your attention, is already enough. For now, you don't have to do anything. Just imagine as you drift towards sleep the sound of footsteps on soft earth, not hurried, not in pain, just a steady, quiet rhythm, heel, arch, toes, a body balancing over hips that learned over millions of years to carry that weight. The sound stretches back through time, through the last ice age, past the small bands crossing African grasslands, past Ardi's careful placing of each foot on the forest floor, step after step fading into darkness. Somewhere along that line, one set of footprints becomes yours. Let that thought soften everything. The back, the knees, the feet that have worked for you all day. Let the long experiment of walking hold you for a while. Good night from deep time. Sleep well, upright ape.